So I've kind of already addressed what I'm doing during the quarantine, my general attitude towards it, and just how I've approached this situation as an au pair. You can go to my video, how I'm keeping busy in quarantine, to see that. But I did want to make a video about my decision to stay in France during this time. I had only arrived a week before the whole crisis started in France and the whole lockdown started. And so it wasn't exactly an easy decision to stay. There was a tipping point where I called my family crying, and I was like, I had to decide. It was just a moment where I had to decide whether it was right to go home or whether it was right to stay. And I just wanted to talk through the different kind of aspects of COVID-19 that I took into account and how I made that decision. I'm going to let you know right now, if you are the type of person that gets really anxious hearing about the disease, if you are the type of person that your day is negatively affected by any news of COVID-19, this might not be the video for you, because in it, I'm going to go through the differences I see in the US's approach to the virus and the approach that the French government has taken. If you live in the US, hearing an international perspective might create a little bit of anxiety about parts of your situation that you really have no control over, but it might also give you a perspective of what to expect from other people and what is reasonable to expect from your government, because a lot of what came into my decision, or a lot of what played into my decision to stay, was the fact that I honestly do feel safer here in France during this pandemic. So one big reason I feel more comfortable here is because the response to COVID-19 in the country of France has been very strict and very unified, and also very consistent. Right now we're closing out week 4 of being in lockdown as a country, and in the past 4 weeks, the government has only gotten stricter about lockdown. It has implemented more rules and more enforcements of the rules, which is different than other countries that once they're a little bit into quarantine, sometimes they start letting up or start relaxing on the rules. There's obviously a lot of temptation to go visit family and friends, and the French government has responded to the fact that as time goes on, people start getting a little bit lax about quarantine by increasing their enforcement of it. Before I was an au pair, I was actually a middle school teacher. One of the reasons why middle school is considered to be one of the most difficult age groups to teach is because of discipline problems. They start to really arise in middle school. And the reason that discipline problems start to really arise when you get into that 11, 12, 13, 14 age range is because that is a time in a child's life where they're coming to a fundamental understanding about the world. That understanding is that if a rule is created but it is not enforced, if someone has a rule but there are no consequences to go along with it, the rule effectively doesn't exist. This is just the truth of how the world works. A rule has to have a consequence for it to work and for it to exist. So right now, in a lot of parts of the US, there are rules that are being put in place, people are being asked to do things, but there's no enforcement of it and there's no consequence. For example, in France, if I leave the house for any reason, like the allowed reasons, I have to have a signed piece of paper that says where I live, my address on it, it says the time I'm leaving at, it says the date, it has all of this information, even information that they really shouldn't need, like where the city I was born in, because it's the French government and they always want extra information for their bureaucratic processes. But yeah, I take this piece of paper with me if I'm going out for any reason, and that way they can look at it. If I run past a kilometer when I'm exercising, they can look at it and say, hey, this is your address. You are 1.5 kilometers away, here's a fine. And now with the holiday season, the French government has actually announced that they might start arresting people for trying to go on holiday, trying to visit family during the Easter season. This probably sounds crazy to a lot of Americans, understandably so. It's not normal within the American culture to give your government that much authority or that much power, especially the idea of arresting people to go visit family during a holiday. That would probably seem really extreme to Americans. But for me, I feel a lot safer knowing that the government is taking it that seriously, because I know that really there's a lot of people that's going to be the only thing that stops them, is a fear of a consequence. And also it communicates to people how serious the situation really is, which I think a lot of people are having a hard time understanding. Another reason I decided to stay was because I just felt like it was the most productive thing for me to do. In France, I had a job, I had responsibilities, I had a role to play in my host family where I'm actually helping them out by keeping their kids busy, by helping them with childcare. At home, I wouldn't really have that. I would just be sitting at home with my family with really nothing to do in a day. I would have no structure in my day, and I was really concerned about that because I know that structure and routine is so important for mental health, as is having a purpose. And, you know, this way I could continue my professional plans, which were to be an au pair in the first place. Nothing was really disrupted by this for me, but if I had chosen to go home to America, that would have been very disruptive for my plans. It would just be a gap in my resume, a gap in my life that was very purposeless, as opposed to staying here where I actually have a pretty good purpose in being here. Also, the difference between the French attitude, at least as I see it in my host family, because again, I haven't had contact with anyone outside of my host family, and so I have a more limited perspective on it, so keep that in mind. But my French family and the news, the perspective that I see there versus the perspective I see in America from watching the American news, from talking to my American friends, and just from being on social media, it's a very stark difference. One example of people not taking isolation super seriously is buying stuff from strangers on Craigslist. Like, meeting up with a stranger for any reason is breaking the lockdown, breaking the quarantine, and I get it. To my friend who did this, I understand why. It shows a kind of relaxed attitude towards the quarantine. Another example, this is just more general from YouTube. The van lifers Trent and Allie arrived safely in DC. We're staying with Allie's mom, and right now they're taking a road trip across America to go to Utah because they feel like being in Utah. That's not essential travel. So I would put it like this. There is a very big contrast between what Americans I've seen justifying to themselves as essential travel or essential interaction or essential breaking of quarantine, and what the French perspective is on that. And I think, again, a lot of it comes down to enforcement. If you are at risk of getting a $500 fine leaving your house, going to buy something from a stranger, you would probably say, hey, I'm not actually going to do that. Also, in France, all the restaurants are closed down. All the deliveries have closed down. That's not considered essential. People can feed themselves. If you don't know how to feed yourself, you can figure out how to cook. Like, you can make ramen every day. It's just not considered essential here. Whereas in America, as far as I can tell, it seems like restaurants are still in full swing operation. People are still delivering. And every time you have a delivery person coming to your house, that is putting yourself at risk, and that's putting the delivery person at risk. That's still a lot of interaction. In France, actually, they've reduced the amount of days that mail can be delivered, and Amazon is only delivering essential items right now, items deemed essential. So again, you can see the difference between people who, in America, you can still get out takeout. There are people who are still delivery people who are doing their jobs, who consider themselves to be essential workers. and they're not delivering like masks, they're not delivering like necessities, they're delivering takeout food, versus in France where that's just not allowed. Another example is just significant others going to stay at like one person's house, at one person's apartment, and like if you decide to quarantine with your significant other, that's probably a great decision because then you're going to be less lonely. But if you're going from one set of roommates, living there for a couple weeks, then moving to another set of roommates, that's a huge violation of self-isolation and quarantine, because now instead of exposing yourself to, say, 3 other people with the roommates, now you've exposed yourself to 6 people in the past 2 weeks. It wasn't necessary to do that in the first place. And so just moving because you feel like you'd be more comfortable there, moving because you feel like you miss someone, you miss a certain place, you miss a certain lifestyle, that's non-essential movement. And I think that there's just different, I would put it as there's different levels of sacrifice that people are willing to make. And in America, it just seems like people they have a lot lower standards for what can be considered essential. And then another example, I touched on this a little bit, but just the example of going to visit family. I think that I've just seen in America, you know, you'll say you're a college student who's dating someone and you have a significant other that you really like. Maybe that significant other comes and stays with your family for a while, and then after a few weeks you go and stay with their family, and there's also like extended family who are in the situation, so you're actually being exposed to quite a lot of people. And then, sorry about this bird, and then you decide that you're sick of your families and so you go back to your college town. Or you're just a college student, you're a single college student. You go to stay with your family for a while. After a couple weeks, you get a little stir crazy, so you go back to your apartment at college, and then vice versa. And maybe while you're at your apartment at college, you have roommates who are doing the same thing. So now you've effectively exposed all of your roommates to any risk that, any contagion that might be in your family. They've exposed you all to their families. I think that is where I see a lot of the difference in attitude. Like in France, I think that it's good that they are fining people, that they are stopping people, that they are potentially arresting people for going to visit family during the holidays, because that is how the virus spreads. It's really just that simple. Like that is how the virus spreads, and it's not essential to go and spend time with your family. It's a luxury, and it sucks that that's a luxury because that's something that we think of as a right. But in a time like this, you could be killing people by making that decision. You could be causing permanent health damage to others by making that decision to go spend time with loved ones or go live in a different place or switch things up for a week. Okay, so now that I've touched on some of the reasons that I chose to stay here, I want to explore some of the reasons why it was a difficult decision. It wasn't clear cut. First of all, I mean, France has been hit hard. Like, the amount of cases in France and the US, I think, is roughly equal, and France is a much smaller country. I mean, we are next door neighbors to Italy, so it is no surprise. Even before we were hit hard, I kind of knew. I mean, you saw Italy, you saw Spain, and so there was kind of writing on the wall for what France's future was. And so that was a hard decision to make because we are a country that is struggling a lot with the virus. Another reason that it was a difficult decision to make, the biggest reason, was the idea that I couldn't go home if I needed to. So let's say someone in my family was to get really sick, maybe even pass away. I might not even be able to attend that funeral. Like, that is the reality of where we are right now. I might not be allowed to fly. There probably won't be any flights for quite a while. And so that was a big consideration of mine, is what if there is a family emergency and I cannot go home for it? That was a risk that I had to be willing to take. Another thing that I had to consider, I was given the privilege of, and if you watch my vlogs, you know, I went to the doctor the first day I was in France because my earring had grown into my ear, and within the first week of being in France, I had to go and have my ear cut open and my earring pulled out. I experienced, having a doctor like cut open my ear and pull something out, and it was really interesting, and it really enlightened me in a couple of ways. The first way is like, you cannot imagine the experience of being like conscious and having someone cut you open and like give you anesthetic and not being able to communicate with them, because this doctor did not speak English. I mean, very few people in my town, like the minority of people probably speak fluent English in my town. It's a small town. People don't speak English everywhere, especially not in France. And so I could not communicate directly with my doctor. My host mom was there, but it was a very different experience. When you normally get numbed in a localized area, they'll poke it, kind of ask you like, can you feel this, can you feel that, to make sure that they've done it properly. There was none of that, and I think that a lot of it had to do with the language barrier. He didn't make sure that it was fully numbed before he started on the procedure, so I could feel it a little bit, and immediately after we were done, I mean, it only took like 15 minutes, it was hurting quite a bit, because I don't think that he had numbed it the proper amount because he hadn't gone through the process of asking me, because there was a language barrier there. That really opened up my eyes to how different it would be to experience being treated by medical professionals that did not speak your language. And if I was to get very sick, as some young people do with coronavirus, if I was to have to go to the hospital, I wouldn't have access to my host family to help me translate. And almost like most of the doctors would not speak English. That would just be the reality of it. And even if they do, it is usually a very limited amount of English. That experience would be really, really horrible, honestly. I can imagine it now that I've gone through the experience of having doctor's appointments and not being able to communicate. I can imagine what it would be like to be deathly ill, to sit in a hospital bed, not be able to articulate your symptoms, not be able to communicate with your doctor about what's feeling differently, not being able to get comforted. There's really no way you can have a good bedside manner with someone who you don't speak the language. You can't assure them that everything's going to be okay. You can't put their case into a larger context. Like, it inevitably impacts the quality of care that you are getting, because doctors depend on patients to communicate the experience that they're having with their disease, to communicate about what they're doing. And so that was a really big consideration. Now, a lot of people think of France as having a much better health system than the US, and I've seen a lot of expats saying that they're glad here because the healthcare system is so much better. For me, I think part of my perspective comes from, again, having actually experienced what it's like to be in a situation where you're having something relatively serious happen to you, like getting surgery, even minor surgery, and not being able to communicate. I think that it's really hard for people to understand how difficult that situation really is until you've experienced it. So people are a little overly optimistic on what their experiences would be like. And then I think another reason that people say that people are more comfortable with the French healthcare system is because it's all paid for, it's all socialized, and that's a very big deal if you're coming from America where you had no health insurance or very poor health insurance. For me, I'm under the age of 25. I'm still on my mom's health insurance, and it's really good. She works for the state, and so that's not so much of an advantage for me because I'm in a very privileged position at home where in most cases I would be able to get care and get it relatively affordably. So that was just some of my thoughts about why I decided to stay versus go. Those were most of the major things that I took into consideration. And I just wanted to make this video, first of all, so that I can remember this time in my life, remember why I made the decision that I made, but also help other people if maybe you decided to stay abroad and you're questioning that decision, or maybe you decided to go home and you're questioning that decision. I would encourage you to focus on the reasons that you made the right decision. So if you went home, if you made the decision to go home and you were abroad, now you've made that decision. You can't change that decision. So what I'd focus on is the fact that it would be probably pretty traumatic, honestly, to have to get medical care from someone who does not speak your first language or who does not speak your language at all. You're so vulnerable in that moment, and to not be able to communicate with your healthcare provider, it just is a very difficult situation. So focus on that. Focus on the fact that you are close to family and friends in case of an emergency. Focus on the fact that you went back to the place that you feel more comfortable. And if you decided to stay, focus on what your country's doing that your home country is not to protect people from the virus. Focus on the opportunities that you held on to while staying here. I think that whatever decision you make, you have to be very solid in that decision, because self-doubt can cause a lot of unnecessary anguish. So I hope that this video gave you some insight into what it's like to be staying abroad during this crisis. I hope that it also, if you're in America, maybe made you think twice about the decisions you're making, about what you're really considering to be essential travel. And lastly, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, especially if you made it to the end. I know things will be a little bit different while we're in quarantine, but I'm still gonna keep on trying to record this time and reflect on this time, because I do want to remember it for the rest of my life just as much as I want to remember any other part of my trip to France.